With the end of World War II, we helped rout the Nazi threat in Europe and defeated Japan in the Pacific. But then a new threat was spreading and a new era of American foreign policy was born. This episode will primarily focus on the Cold War period. I'll touch on overt interventions like Korea and Vietnam, but I mostly want to focus on covert interventions in countries like Italy, Iran, Chile, and Cuba.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last! Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
You're not hurting anybody with force, fraud, coercion, theft, or violence. Your life is your life, your body is your body, your business is your business, and your property is your property. It's not mine, and it sure as hell is not the federal government's.
The fight against communism led to numerous interventions, both overt and covert, in various countries. These often aim to prevent the spread of Soviet influence or support anti-communist regimes. The war in Vietnam in particular highlighted the challenges and costs of prolonged intervention. The United States' involvement in the Korean War was a pivotal moment in the early Cold War, driven by the policy of containment against the spread of communism. After World War II, Korea, formerly occupied by Japan, was divided at the 38th parallel into a Soviet-backed communist North and a US-backed democratic South. Both governments claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula, and tensions between them escalated on June 25, 1950. North Korea, with support from the Soviet Union, launched a full-scale invasion of South Korea, rapidly pushing South Korean forces and early arriving US troops south toward the port of Busan. President Harry S. Truman viewed the invasion as a direct challenge by the Soviet Union and a test of the US's resolve to contain communist expansion. He feared that if South Korea fell, it would embolden communist aggression elsewhere, particularly in Europe. The war largely settled into a bloody stalemate around the 38th parallel. The US adopted a strategy of limited war, aiming to restore the pre-war status quo rather than pursuing a full conquest of North Korea, which risked a wider conflict with China and potentially the Soviet Union. After prolonged and often contentious negotiations, an armistice agreement was signed on July 27, 1953, by military commanders from the United States representing the UN Command, the Korean People's Army, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. South Korea never formally signed the armistice. The armistice established a demilitarized zone along the front line, roughly following the 38th parallel, to separate the forces. It also provided for the exchange of prisoners of war. The war was incredibly costly, resulting in millions of casualties, including over 36,000 US service members killed. Crucially, the armistice was a ceasefire, not a formal peace treaty. Therefore, the Korean Peninsula technically remains in a state of war to this day. The United States' involvement in the Vietnam War was a complex and deeply impactful period in American history, spanning from the 1950s to 1973. With direct military escalation beginning in 1965. U.S. involvement was primarily driven by the Cold War policy of containment. The Domino theory suggested that if one Southeast Asian country fell to communism, others would follow. Initially, the U.S. provided military and financial aid to France in its efforts to maintain colonial control over Vietnam in the early 1950s. After France's defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the Geneva Accords divided Vietnam into a communist North and a non-communist South. The U.S. supported the government of South Vietnam, sending military advisors to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, also known as the ARVN. In 1964, after alleged attacks on U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, President Lyndon B. Johnson secured the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution from Congress, granting him broad authority to take military action in Vietnam. This was a pivotal moment, paving the way for full-scale U.S. intervention. In early 1965, the U.S. launched a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Shortly after, President Johnson committed the first U.S. ground combat troops to Vietnam, initially to defend air bases, but quickly expanding to direct combat operations against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces. The U.S. military presence in Vietnam peaked in April 1969 with 543,000 personnel. Under President Nixon, the strategy of Vietnamization began aiming to gradually withdraw U.S. troops while expanding and equipping the ARVN to take on more combat responsibility. A peace agreement was signed on January 1973 by the U.S., North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong, officially ending direct U.S. military involvement. The last U.S. military unit left Vietnam on March 29, 1973. Despite the peace accords, fighting continued between North and South Vietnam. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, leading to the reunification of Vietnam under communist rule. Operation Gladio was the code name for a series of clandestine stay-behind operations organized by Western intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA and NATO, in collaboration with various European intelligence services during the Cold War. While Gladio specifically refers to the Italian branch, the term is often used informally to describe the broader network across Western Europe and some neutral countries. The stated purpose of these networks was to prepare for and counter a potential Soviet invasion of Western Europe. In the event of an occupation, these stay-behind units would conduct sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and intelligence gathering behind enemy lines. They aimed to provide a resistance force and facilitate the eventual liberation of occupied territories. These secret soldiers were trained in various locations, often by elite units like the U.S. Green Berets and British SAS. They were equipped with weapons, explosives, and communication gear hidden in secret caches. Critics and some investigations allege that certain Gladio-linked elements, often in collusion with right-wing extremists and military intelligence, engaged in a strategy of tension. This involved carrying out terrorist attacks, sometimes under false flags, to create a climate of fear and instability. The alleged aim was to discredit left-wing political parties, prevent them from gaining power, and justify increased state control, or even military intervention. Investigations in Italy, for example, linked Gladio members and their associated right-wing groups to bombings and other acts of violence. The United States Department of State has consistently rejected claims that it supported terrorists, maintaining that the operation was solely for resistance against a potential Soviet invasion. The existence of Operation Gladio came to light in 1990 when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti confirmed its existence to the Italian Senate. This revelation sparked a wave of investigations and political public debate across Europe. In the early 1950s, Mohammad Mosaddegh, a fervent nationalist, rose to power in Iran. His most significant policy was the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British company that effectively controlled Iran's vast reserves and profits. This move severely threatened British economic interests. The British and eventually the Americans became concerned that Mossadegh's nationalist policies and his willingness to work with the Communist Tudeh Party, even though Mossadegh himself was anti-communist, could lead Iran to fall into the Soviet orbit. Iran's strategic location bordering the Soviet Union and sitting on massive oil reserves vital to Western Europe made this a major geopolitical concern. The CIA under President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration collaborated with MI6 to plan and execute a coup. The operation was led on the ground by CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt Jr. The operation involved a sophisticated campaign of propaganda and political manipulation. The CIA spread disinformation and false narratives to undermine Mossadegh's credibility. They organized street protests and riots, sometimes playing both pro-Mossadegh and anti-Mossadegh groups to create a chaotic environment that was then blamed on Mossadegh himself. They then convinced the Shah that the US and UK supported him and wanted to protect Iran from Soviet threat, necessitating Mossadegh's removal. The initial attempt to oust Mossadegh in August 1953 almost failed, leading the Shah to flee the country briefly. However, with continued CIA support and the mobilization of pro-Shah military forces and paid mobs, a second attempt succeeded on August 19, 1953. Mossadegh was arrested, tried for treason, imprisoned, and eventually placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was restored to power and ruled as an increasingly authoritarian monarch with strong US backing for the next 26 years. The 1953 coup had profound and lasting consequences for US-Iranian relations. Many Iranians resented the US for its role in overthrowing their democratically elected leader and installing an autocratic regime. This deep-seated distrust and anti-American sentiment became a major factor contributing to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which ultimately overthrew the Shah and led to the establishment of the Islamic Republic, fundamentally reshaping the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a failed military landing operation in Cuba in April 1961, orchestrated by the United States with the goal of overthrowing Fidel Castro's communist government. It stands as one of the most significant and embarrassing foreign policy blunders in U.S. history during the Cold War. Fidel Castro led a successful revolution that overthrew the US-backed dictator Fulgencio Batista on January 1, 1959. Castro's government quickly moved to nationalize US-owned businesses and assets in Cuba and establish closer ties with the Soviet Union. This alarmed the US, which viewed Castro as a Soviet client and a potential threat to its security and influence in Latin America, especially given Cuba's proximity to Florida. In response, the US began to cut off sugar purchases from Cuba, impose an economic embargo, and eventually broke diplomatic ties. The plan for an invasion was initiated by the CIA under President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration in early 1960. The CIA had a track record of successful covert operations such as the 1954 coup in Guatemala and believed a similar approach could work in Cuba. The core of the invasion force was made up of around 1,500 Cuban exiles. They were trained and financed by the CIA in secret camps in Guatemala and Nicaragua. When John F. Kennedy became president in January 1961, he inherited the invasion plan, which was nearly ready for execution. After much debate and consultation with his advisors, Kennedy approved the operation, though with some modifications that ultimately proved detrimental. On April 15, 1961, CIA supplied B-26 bombers piloted by Cuban exiles with Cuban markings attacked Cuban airfields to destroy Castro's air force. However, these airstrikes were largely ineffective and alerted the Cuban government. On April 17th, the main invasion force landed at Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southwestern coast. The area was chosen for its relative isolation, but it also had challenging terrain, including coral reefs that damaged invasion vessels and made it difficult to unload supplies. Crucially, President Kennedy, adhering to his desire for deniability, canceled promised follow-up airstrikes and direct U.S. air cover for the invasion force. This left the invaders vulnerable to Castro's remaining air force and ground troops. Contrary to the CIA's intelligence, which had greatly underestimated Castro's popularity and the strength of his forces, the invasion did not spark a popular uprising. Instead, the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces, personally led by Fidel Castro, quickly mobilized and met the invaders with overwhelming force. The Bay of Pigs cemented a deep-seated distrust between Cuba and the United States that persists to this day, shaping the political and economic relationships between the two nations. The United States had extensive and continuous covert involvement in Chile during the Cold War, particularly in the decade leading up to the 1973 military coup. The primary objective was to prevent the rise and then undermine the government of Salvador Allende, a democratically elected socialist president. Even before Allende's 1970 election, the CIA spent significant amounts of money to influence Chilean presidential elections, aiming to prevent him from winning. For instance, in 1964, the CIA spent millions of dollars to support Eduardo Frei Montalva, a Christian Democrat candidate against Allende. When Allende won a plurality in the September 1970 election, meaning he didn't win an absolute majority requiring a congressional vote to confirm his presidency, President Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger decided to prevent him from taking office. This led to a two-track strategy. This involved attempts to bribe members of the Chilean Congress to vote against Allende and for a more amenable candidate, or to encourage a constitutional coup, where President Frei would resign, allowing for a new election that Allende would presumably lose. This track was largely managed by the State Department, though with some covert elements. This was a more aggressive and secret CIA operation, personally ordered by President Nixon and managed by Henry Kissinger. Its explicit goal was to foment a military coup in Chile. A key obstacle to this plan was the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army, General René Schneider, who was a staunch defender of Chile's constitutional democracy and opposed military interventions in politics. The CIA, in coordination with coup plotters, planned to kidnap Schneider to remove him from his position. The kidnapping attempt on General Schneider on October 22, 1970 went horribly wrong. He was shot and later died from his wounds. Instead of sparking a coup as intended, his assassination had the opposite effect. It created widespread public outrage and galvanized support for get democratic institutions, leading the Chilean Congress to confirm Allende as president. With the failure of Operation FUBELT, President Nixon and the CIA took further action to ensure a military coup would take place. President Nixon famously ordered the CIA to make the economy scream. The US implemented an invisible economic blockade, cutting off loans and aid to Chile and pursuing international financial institutions to do the same. This, combined with Allende's nationalization of the US-owned copper companies, led to severe economic problems, including inflation and shortages. The CIA funded opposition political parties, media outlets, and labor strikes to create social and political unrest, which further undermined Allende's government. On September 11, 1973, a military junta led by General Pinochet overthrew Allende's government in a violent coup. Allende died during the attack on the presidential palace. The US swiftly recognized Pinochet's new military dictatorship, despite the regime's well-documented human rights abuses, including widespread torture, murder, and political repression. The US provided military and economic aid to Pinochet's government. Decades later, declassified documents revealed the extent of the US's covert actions in Chile. These documents showed that US officials were aware of the military's plans to overthrow Allende in the days leading up to the coup. While in last week's video, I felt that the US's foreign interventions were noble and it was important for the country to intervene, this week's episode tells a different story. There were many more times the US overtly or covertly intervened in another country's affairs during the time frame of 1946 to 1990. But I felt these examples best exemplified what we were doing and why we were doing it. The reasons for all of these interventions, as I stated in the intro, was to stop the spread of communism, and in turn we set the CIA with pretty much unlimited funds and almost no oversight loose on the world. I am very much against communism and despise it in all of its forms, but was there really a true threat of the USSR and communism taking over the world? There was a slight risk of that, but I'll save my full thoughts for the final video of this series, where I will recap everything and give my thoughts on our evolution into a world superpower. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Be sure to hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date with what we're doing on the channel. And remember, politicians hide themselves away. They only started the war. Why should they go out to fight? They leave that all to the poor. Black Sabbath, War Pigs. Rest in peace, Ozzy. Critics in some investigations allege that certain Gladio-linked elements, often in collusion with right-wing extremists and military intelligence, engage in Steve, stop it! So that is our cat, Steve. He has not wanted to be in this office all day until I started recording. Now he's scratching at the door and meowing, wanting to be let in.